Would like to welcome everybody tonight who's joined us for this final in our series of 6 lectures, Why Study the History of Trotskyism. This is a series that has been organised by the Socialist Equality Party, which is the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. My name is Patrick O'Connor. I'm a member of the SCP's National Committee, and I'll be chairing proceedings again tonight. Thank you very much to all of those who've let us know where you're participating from across Australia, and internationally. We have participants from New Zealand, Sri Lanka, the United States and Britain, who've indicated so far internationally, and in every major city that I'm aware of across Australia. So good evening. Of course, the format of this lecture series that we've organised, being held over Zoom, was forced upon us by the extraordinary circumstances of the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously here where I'm in Melbourne, this is again threatening to trigger mass infections within the working class. But the series, as we've organised it and as it's developed, has proved immensely important. It's brought together a wide range of workers and young people from across Australia, including in areas where the Socialist Equality Party does not yet have branches. And it's also brought together supporters internationally. We've been very fortunate to have a range of lecturers over the last 5 weeks, led by 2 of our most experienced comrades, who I'll introduce shortly, but also involving, importantly, several younger comrades who for the first time have presented for a public audience the history of the Fourth International and have spoken on its contemporary burning relevance for the situation today. We began the series on June 2nd with a lecture titled October 1917, the opening shot of the World Revolution. We continued the next week on June 9 with the left opposition struggle against Stalinism. Following on from that, we dealt with the question of the founding of the Fourth International in 1938, the World Party of Socialist Revolution, established by Leon Trotsky. On June 23, lecture 4, we dealt with the establishment of the International Committee of the Fourth International in 1953 and the struggle against Pavlovite revisionism. The following week, we dealt with the complex political issues bound up with the 1985-1986 split with the Workers' Revolutionary Party in Britain and the subsequent renaissance of Marxism that emerged within our World Party, within the International Committee. Again, anybody with us tonight who wasn't with us for over the previous 5 weeks, you can view all of those lectures. You just need to click on the links that are in the chat box, connect via the Socialist Equality Party's Facebook or YouTube accounts, and you can review those videos. We definitely encourage everybody here who hasn't seen those lectures to view them, and if you have seen them, worth revisiting in light of the series overall. Tonight, however, our topic is a new period of socialist revolution and the tasks of the Fourth International. And the lecturer is Nick Beams. Nick delivered the first lecture in this series, so we're bringing him back to conclude the series. Nick, of course, many of you are very familiar with. He is a well-known authority on Marxist political economy, and he's been a leading figure in the Trotskyist movement for more than 40 years now. Nick, as he discussed in last week's meeting, for those of you who were with us, he was radicalised during the international upsurge of workers and youth that erupted in 1968. And he was won to the Trotskyist movement through an attraction to the historical struggle that was waged by the British Trotskyist and the International Committee against Stalinism and Pavlovite revisionism. He was a founding member of the SEP's predecessor organisation, the Socialist Labour League, in 1972, and he served as the party's national secretary between 1985 and 2015. He's a member of the World Socialist website International Editorial Board, and his byline would be very familiar to regular readers of the website, as he writes not just on questions of political economy, but also geostrategic politics, history, struggles within the international working class, Australian politics, and a range of other important issues. So I'll introduce Comrade Nick. Good evening.
Good evening. So tonight, as Patrick has said, we're discussing a very important issue, this new period that we're in. The International Committee of the Fourth International was established in 1953 with the issuing of the open letter to the World Trotskyist movement by the US Socialist Workers' Party National Secretary James P. Cannon. Now, the period since then falls roughly into 2 halves. The period from 1953 to 85 and the period from 1985 to the present day. The period 1953 to 85, as Zach Hambides outlined in his lecture, was one in which the orthodox Trotskyists fought what amounted to a civil war to defend the program and principles on which the Fourth International had been founded in 1938 by Leon Trotsky.
It came to a successful conclusion with the defeat of the national-opportunists of the Workers' Revolutionary Party in 1985-86, opening up a new period, as Oscar Grenfell set out in his lecture last week. This was marked by a renaissance of Marxism, leading to the forging of the theoretical, political, and organisational foundations for the building of the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Now we have entered a new period. It is marked by two interconnected developments: the ongoing breakdown of the capitalist system and a resurgence of international class struggle. It has placed the perspective of world socialist revolution squarely on the agenda, not as some theoretical or abstract perspective, but as a living reality. The founding program of our movement is entitled The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. For a whole period, the phrase, the death agony of capitalism, may have appeared, at least to some, to be somewhat exaggerated. It seemed as if, during the post-war period, capitalism had somehow overcome the contradictions that ripped it apart in the opening half of the 20th century. But as Trotsky explained, it is always necessary to think in the long term, in decades, and to locate each stage in the unfolding of the crisis of the capitalist system within the course of a broad historical development. The post-war period, to be sure, is a long span of time in the life of an individual, but it has turned out to be simply a phase in a protracted historical crisis. And so today, we are gaining at first hand, in living experience, an appreciation of what is meant by the death agony of capitalism. How else can one describe the present situation in which millions of people are facing death and billions face impoverishment because of the refusal and inability of the present social order to deal in a rational and scientific way with the COVID-19 pandemic, now out of control, as daily figures indicate, in the US, the richest country in the world? How else can one characterize a situation in which the mass of working people confront economic devastation on a scale only seen before in the Great Depression, while the financial oligarchy on Wall Street and their counterparts around the world rake in wealth on an unprecedented scale? In the US, this has created what the historian Victoria Bynum so rightly described in the July 4 forum hosted by the WSWS, which I urge you to view if you have not already done so, as an American nightmare of inequality. And rising rapidly over the horizon into clear and present danger are existential threats of climate change and war, potentially involving the use of nuclear weapons, threatening the foundations of human civilization. But as Marx explained, no great problem ever arises in the course of humanity's development without the material conditions for its resolution also being present, or at least in the process of formation. The solution to the crisis of mankind is emerging in the resurgence of the working class on an international scale. After decades of suppression, it is now returning to the arena of struggle, a transformation which has been noted by more perceptive sections of the bourgeoisie out of fear for what it portends. And the very fact that for the past 3 decades and more, social contradictions have been suppressed means that when they erupt, they do so with explosive force. Recently, the Center for International and Strategic Studies, a US imperialist think tank, provided an assessment of the international situation. We are living in an age of global mass protests, it said, that are historically unprecedented in frequency and scope and size. They had eclipsed, it said, anything seen in the post-war period. As the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning, a journalist, Andreas Kluth, wrote in a Bloomberg article, quote, "The most misleading cliche about the coronavirus is that it treats us all the same. It doesn't, neither medically, nor economically, socially, or psychologically. In particular, COVID-19 exacerbates pre-existing conditions of inequality whenever it arrives. Before long, this will cause social turmoil up to and including uprisings and revolutions." Close quote. Now, at present, this movement has been characterized as leaderless, but the masses are driven to find a solution, and that poses ever more directly and squarely the task at hand, the resolution of the crisis of working class leadership. So let me briefly review how our movement has prepared for this new period. The analysis of the historic crisis of world capitalism carried out by the International Committee of the Fourth International following the defeat of national opportunism centered on revealing the objective processes that would give rise to a new period of social revolution. It centered on the objective significance and implications of the globalization of capitalist production and the way in which the drive of the productive forces to leap over national boundaries and borders had intensified the contradiction between the development of world economy and the nation-state system. It revealed the return at a higher level of the contradiction identified by both Lenin and Trotsky as the ultimate source of the breakdown of capitalism, signified by the outbreak of World War I in 1914, and which led to the opening shot of world socialist revolution in the October 1917 revolution in Russia. Moreover, the globalization of production we analysed had not only raised to a new level all the objective contradictions of the world capitalist system, it brought into being, on a scale never before seen in history, a truly global working class, integrated and unified by the process of capitalist production itself, meaning that the class struggle would not only be international in content, but in form as well. This analysis, now confirmed on a daily basis before our very eyes, was taken forward against all those tendencies, such as postmodernism in academia and in the political sphere, which maintained Marxism was outdated. Their positions also involved expunging revolution from the historical process, as the historian James Oakes drew out in the WSWS forum. In this new schema, there was not an English revolution, a French revolution, nor two American revolutions, and of course, there was to be no socialist revolution. These retrograde tendencies, financed and promoted in the world of academia, maintained that the conception of the revolutionary role of the working class, rooted in the objective social relations of capitalism, had been superseded. Class had to be replaced by new social categories based on race, sexual orientation, and other forms of identity. The working class had somehow disappeared as they advanced the slogan put forward by the French petty bourgeois leftist André Gortz, "Farewell to the working class." Now, there's been considerable confusion promoted in academic and other circles about what constitutes the working class. Identifying it with a particular form of labour, they claim that, at least in the major capitalist countries where industrial labour has declined as a percentage of the working population, it is no longer an independent social force. First of all, we should note this is not a view shared by the ruling classes. Every day, they live in mortal fear of the enormous power of industrial workers and devote considerable resources in collaboration with their policemen, the trade union apparatuses, to try to secure its suppression. The issue we are confronting in this question is that what constitutes the working class is not the act of labour as such, but the social relations within which that labour is carried out. Much has changed since the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago brought the modern working class into being. But throughout this period, one thing has remained the same: the social relations of capitalism, in which one class, the working class, stripped of any access to the means of production, is forced to sell its labour power to the owners of the productive forces, the capitalist class, and the surplus value extracted in that process forms the basis of the profit system and the entire economic order. If we review the past period from this standpoint, what has taken place in the last 4 decades is the greatest proletarianisation of the mass of the world's people ever seen in history. Millions of peasants and other small producers the world over, in Africa, China, India, Latin America, have been transformed into wage workers. In the advanced capitalist countries, we have witnessed the transformation of vast sections of what were once designated as the middle classes into wage workers. Just to take one example, in the medical profession, doctors increasingly no longer have independent practices, but work in medical centres, often owned by financial institutions or in privately owned hospitals and health facilities. Universities, whether state or privately owned, have been corporatised, with staff members employed on short-term temporary contracts, able to be terminated overnight, just as takes place in the rest of the economy. Young people, but older workers as well, are now employed increasingly through mechanisms such as 0 hours contracts, so prevalent in the so-called gig economy, temporary employment and the like. That is the resurrection in modern form of old methods of exploitation that were thought to have passed into history. What has come into being is the emergence of a truly global working class fighting in every part of the world against the same global leviathan of finance capitalism. Workers everywhere face the same problems of greater social inequality, the destruction of basic social facilities needed for modern life. They are confronted at every turn by the rise of authoritarian forms of rule, and now the threat to life itself, as the ruling classes refuse to pursue a rational scientific approach to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and demand that the drive to extract surplus value and profit must take absolute priority. The objective conditions for the realization of the perspective of the Trotskyist movement for the construction of the World Party of Socialist Revolution have come into existence at a level never seen before in history. We have entered a period in which the program of Trotskyism, grounded on the perspective that animated and guided the first successful conquest of political power by the working class, the Russian Revolution of October 1917, a program defended and maintained against Stalinism and the various forms of opportunism that developed within the Fourth International, is now directly intersecting with deep-going historical processes. Now, in their war against Trotskyism over the past 8 decades, the opportunists continually pointed to the big organisations of the labour movement, the trade unions, the social democratic and labour parties, the Stalinist communist parties, which once embraced millions of workers. And in countries of lesser capitalist development, the opportunists insisted that bourgeois nationalist movements such as Castroism, Maoism, and their various offshoots opened the way forward, not the program of Marxism. But Trotsky, in his last days, forecast their fate, declaring that coming events would leave not one stone upon another of these outlived organizations. And so it has come to pass. Nothing is left of them except hollowed out gangs of cliques and electoral machines competing with each other to function as the agencies of the capitalist oligarchy. What has happened to Maoism, which once commanded the support of millions in Asia? It has transformed China into the cheap labour platform of world capitalism. In every country, the trade unions, once comprising millions of members, are a rotting, corrupt, bureaucratic shell, reviled and hated because of their role as the chief agencies for imposing the dictates of finance capital, and which now enforce the homicidal return to work drive of the ruling class. Contrast the fate of these organisations with the record of the International Committee over the past 35 years. It has grown and developed, establishing the theoretical, political, organisational foundations for the building of the World Party. How is this to be explained? It didn't happen automatically. It wasn't preordained. It had to be deliberately and consciously undertaken and fought for. But because the program fought for by the orthodox Trotskyists was based on and rooted in the objective logic of socio-economic developments and the independent interests of the international working class, forged and created by these same processes, it was able to emerge victorious. We've explained that the persistence of opportunism that sought to ravage and liquidate the Fourth International was not the result of bad or ill-motivated individuals, but was the expression of profound historical developments. But to simply direct our focus here would be one-sided and therefore completely wrong. We have to account for the other persistent tendency. That is the persistence of the struggle within the Fourth International, often against great odds, against these forces and their ultimate defeat. That persistence, likewise, has objective foundations. It is rooted in the fact that the struggle waged by genuine Trotskyists and Marxists is the conscious expression of objective reality, the irreconcilable contradiction between the international working class and the ruling capitalist oligarchy. In the course of these lectures, detailing the complex battles inside the Fourth International, the question has been raised, how do you prevent splits? It might, at first sight, appear as if this is the key question, but closer examination is necessary. The real issue is, how do you prevent the growth of opportunism resulting from the pressure of the bourgeoisie, from infecting the Marxist movement, which makes splits necessary? And what must be learned from these struggles as we engage in the most complex task of overthrowing the domination of capital? The crucial lesson to be drawn is that the development of a perspective and program for the working class is only carried forward through the constant working and reworking of the strategic lessons of its historical experiences embodied in the history and struggles of the Trotskyist movement. Its program has been based, to use Marx's words, not on what the working class may think at any given moment, but what it is compelled to do by its very being and life situation. And what it is now compelled to do is posed very directly by its present life situation. The working class represents life, the ruling oligarchy, death and destruction, as history, not just of the recent events, but of the past century and more, demonstrates. Its essence has now once again burst into appearance in daily life. Now, we've conducted this review to locate ourselves in the historical process. That is, to pose and answer the question, where do we now stand in the struggle for human emancipation and freedom, and what is to be done? On January 3rd this year, the World Socialist website published a perspective entitled "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." It began as follows: the arrival of the new year marks the beginning of a decade of intensifying class struggle and world socialist revolution. In the future, it continued, when learned historians write about the upheavals of the 21st century, they will enumerate all the obvious signs that existed as the 2020s began, of the revolutionary storm that was soon to sweep across the globe. The scholars, armed with a vast array of facts, documents, charts, websites, and social media postings, and other forms of valuable digitalized information at their disposal, will describe the 2010s as a period characterized by an intractable economic and political crisis of the capitalist system. Yes, it would be safe to say that never has such a prognosis of the Marxist movement been so powerfully and so rapidly confirmed. We did not, of course, have a crystal ball which predicted the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. But on the basis of its antecedent work and analysis, the International Committee, from the very outset, drew out its significance and implications and has advanced a program to meet the crisis it has provoked. We explained that, like the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand in June 1914 set off World War I, the pandemic was a trigger event that would ignite all the combustible material that had built up in the preceding period. And so it has come to pass. Just as World War I shaped the 20th century, so the pandemic and its outcome will shape events for decades to come. The pandemic was not just a trigger, but an accelerant for underlying processes and contradictions rooted deep within the capitalist system. From the outset, it laid bare the effects of the ongoing drive of the ruling classes around the world to eviscerate health and other vital services going back over decades, as they demanded that the resources of society created by the labour of the working class be devoted to feeding the insatiable drive of finance capital for increased profits and the personal enrichment of its leading representatives. We've seen the sight of healthcare workers battling to deal with health dangers, mass graves and funerals, sights never to be forgotten. The pandemic revealed the growth of fascistic ideologies within the ruling class, the advancement of the homicidal thesis of herd immunity, under which the virus should be allowed to rip through the population, culling the old and sick, useless eaters in Hitler's terminology, to make way for the new. And new horrors are being prepared. Well before the arrival of the pandemic, the US administration had been intensifying its drive to reassert its global hegemony against its rivals, above all China, which it regards as its bigger threat. Imperialism, it has been rightly said, never sleeps, and the onset of the pandemic has seen the intensification of the war drive. In the light of all that has taken place, the denunciations of China by the Trump administration for spreading the virus, the stepped-up attacks on Chinese high-tech companies, the deployment of US military forces against China, the denunciations of Trump by the war hawk Bolton, speaking on behalf of the military and intelligence apparatus for being too soft on China, The recent ASIO raid carried out on a parliamentarian in this country for daring to criticise government policy on China. The plan to station US missiles in Australia directed at China. Can anyone seriously ignore the warnings? Almost overnight, the world's population was confronted with the destructive pandemic. Likewise, war can break out just as rapidly. In mid-March, as a result of limited measures to try to contain the virus, the imposition of lockdowns and social distancing, financial markets, starting on Wall Street and then extending around the world, froze, a result of the speculation since the crisis of 2008. Overnight, trillions of dollars of financial assets were revealed to be essentially worthless, as none of them, including supposedly secure government debt, could be sold. The Fed and other central banks stepped in to bail them out. The debt crisis was to be resolved by the creation of still more debt. It is estimated this intervention amounts to $17 trillion. With the financial markets having spoken, governments responded by insisting the cure could not be worse than the disease and set in place the homicidal return to work agenda. The value of every crisis, it is rightly said, is that it reveals what has been obscured and covered over in the preceding period. In the blink of an eye, the central thesis of Marxist political economy, that the exploitation of the working class is the source of all value and surplus value, was confirmed as the ruling elites and their governments demanded that workers return to work no matter what the dangers to their health and lives, in order that value could be pumped into the mountain of fictitious capital they had created to bail themselves out. In the manner of war profiteering, the stock markets have surged in an orgy of speculation. All over the world, class relations are being restructured. There is not going to be a return to the status quo ante. Millions of jobs are not coming back as emergency measures, such as cutting pay and destroying working conditions, are to be made permanent. How then do we see the course of events as the pandemic deepens and widens and the ruling classes step up their drive to impose the effects of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression onto the backs of the working class? In every major historical crisis, the two main classes are driven to respond in accordance with their objective interests. For the ruling capitalist class, this takes place rather seamlessly. Key sections of the ruling elites within the state and various think tanks play a central role as they summon up a counter-revolutionary strategy. But to some extent, the market also does their thinking for them. For the working class, however, it's a more protracted process. It has to work through its experiences, assess the political developments. And here, the intervention of the Revolutionary Party is the decisive factor. It provides the scientific analysis of those experiences, explaining their meaning, raising the consciousness of the working class, and providing it with a program of action. This intervention is the crucial link in the transformation of an objectively revolutionary situation into an actual socialist revolution. This analysis and program is not drawn out of the air. It rests upon and is derived from the lessons of history we have been discussing in the course of these lectures. On June 23rd, the ICFI published a statement calling for the international working class to take action against the pandemic. It drew out that all the necessary actions to stop the pandemic must be taken on a global scale. But it noted that such action runs up against the barriers of the capitalist nation-state system and the profit interests of the ruling class. We therefore summed up the content of the statement as follows. When the apologists for the ruling class insist, don't let the cure be worse than the disease, workers must reply that the underlying disease is capitalism. The pandemic is a symptom of this disease and the cure is socialism. Within days of the issuing of that statement, auto workers in the US had halted production, insisting that measures be taken to ensure a safe working environment. They represent an initial expression of what is a global upsurge, an elemental striving by the working class to take control of and consciously organise society, the material foundation of which it creates every day through its labour. That is a society dominated neither by aristocratic principle nor the working of markets in the interests of private profit, but by human need. That perspective, so necessary for the arming of the working class, is developed in a political struggle against all the ideological defenders of the ruling class, and they can be clearly identified. For decades, the pseudo-left have promoted the reactionary thesis that race, not class, is the fundamental determinant of social reality. Many of those who accept such positions do so out of ignorance and because they believe they are taking a stand against racism and racial oppression. But before embracing the race-based theory of society, they need to be reminded of its reactionary history. The claim that society is founded on race and not class was and has been the foundation ideology of right-wing and fascistic movements, including Hitler and the Nazis. When the growing social anger, which erupted over the police murder of George Floyd, resulted in mass, multiracial, multi-ethnic demonstrations in the US and around the world, the practitioners of racial politics reacted with extreme hostility. They sought to prevent the understanding that the murder was the action of the capitalist state, the body of armed men that defends the capitalist profit system against the working class. It was, they said, the outcome of whiteness. This was not the product of some mistaken analysis, but the expression of social and class interests. It was the instinctive recognition by these social layers that a movement of the working class in social revolution posed a direct threat to their drive to secure their own privileges within the existing capitalist order, and so they moved to divert it in a reactionary direction. That's why they're seeking to now tear down statues of the leaders of the bourgeois revolutions of the past. In the US, the War of Independence and the Civil War, because they are hostile to the completion of the tasks set out in those revolutions, but unable to be solved by them, and which now fall to the socialist revolution of today. In conclusion, I am informed that studies have revealed that only a limited amount of knowledge can be derived from a single lecture. And so, in concluding this lecture series, there is one vital takeaway I would like to leave with you. It's a quotation from Lenin. He said, "The highest task of humanity is to comprehend this subjective logic of economic evolution, the evolution of social life in its general and fundamental features, so that it may be possible to adapt to it one's social consciousness and the consciousness of the advanced classes of all capitalist countries in as clear and critical a fashion as possible." I urge you to act on these words and apply to join today the International Committee of the Fourth International and play your part in building it to provide the necessary leadership for the coming World Socialist Revolution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick, for that really comprehensive lecture, which summarised and spanned the content of the previous 5 lectures that we've delivered, as well as dealing with the broad spectrum of morbid symptoms that have appeared in the last period with the deepening capitalist crisis, including the COVID pandemic, the eruption of class struggle in the United States and internationally. I encourage everybody now to consider what you would like to put to Comrade Nick. Any questions in relationship to anything at all that's been raised in the course of the lecture, or any questions in relationship to the previous week's lectures, which perhaps we didn't cover in sufficient depth. While everybody is busily typing in your questions into the chat box, those of you who haven't yet opened that, please do so. You can see the speech bubble and the word chat under it. We'll use that to direct questions tonight. But while you're typing in your questions, I'll introduce Comrade Cheryl Crisp to our panel tonight. Good evening, Cheryl.
G'day, Patrick. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So just to introduce Cheryl, for those of you who don't know, Cheryl is the Assistant National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, our section here of the International Committee of the Fourth International. She has played a central role in the struggle for Trotskyism over several decades now, and she joined, like Comrade Nick, the predecessor organisation of the SEP, the Socialist Labour League, at its founding in 1972. And she's been very active internationally in different online events that our World Party has held since the pandemic erupted. And she also delivered the second lecture in this series on the struggles of Leon Trotsky and the left opposition against the emergence of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the 1920s. So welcome, Cheryl. We still have people typing in your questions. Just Jamie Baker asks whether the lecture will be published as an article. We haven't transcribed the previous lectures that are available to be reviewed on YouTube or on the Socialist Equality Party's Facebook video account. While other people are considering their questions, I would just like to pick up on one issue. Perhaps Nick could kick us off. And this touches on different aspects of what you raised tonight. The question of class and what is the working class? It's a very common question that's put to us by young people coming around the party, coming into left-wing socialist politics. And it also touches on the previous lecture that Comrade Oscar Grenfell gave in the aftermath of the defeat of the British miners. There was a position put very broadly within intellectual circles, within academia, that the working class was dead, was finished as a social force. Andre Gores, as you raised, I believe, last week, farewell to the working class, identifying one form of the working class, a sort of traditional industrial manufacturing working class, with a working class as a whole. Now we see the emergence of different strata, the gig economy, casualised labour, the precarious workers and so on. Could you elaborate on that point? And in particular, what is the difference between, you raise that class is the fundamental basis of society. Well, why is that? Because sometimes people say, well, class is one identity among many. You can have racial identity, ethnic identity, gender identity, class identity. What is the difference between those categories?
Well, to take the question of class, Marx once made the point that the structure of every class society, and we have lived in class society since the ending of man's birth, the ending of what was known as primitive communism. With the development of the productivity of labour, as mankind, humankind progressed, a surplus arose. And the possibility of one section of society, a small section of society, living at the expense of the mass of the population emerged. And we've seen, and that provided the objective basis for the development of class society, of slavery, of feudalism, capitalism. But Marx made the point very centrally that the secret of every society is the way in which that surplus labour, in essence, which is the basis of all socio-economic organisation, is pumped out of the exploited class. It's different in slavery. The slave does not sell his or her labour power to the slave owner. The slave is owned. It's a different set of class relations. The feudal peasant doesn't sell his product to the feudal lord, he hands over a portion of it. What is the basis of capitalist society is that this surplus is extracted through the selling of the only commodity that the worker has,
labour power. Marx assumes that that labour power is paid at its full value in the form of a wage, but in the course of the production process, the capitalist class is able to extract additional or surplus value. For example, the value of labour power may embody 4 hours of labour embodied in socially necessary goods, but the worker doesn't work for 4 hours. He or she works for 8, and that surplus is rendered free, gratis, to the owners of the means of production. And this is the basis of capitalist society. Now, we can, I think in a previous lecture we raised a point. Let us, as a thought experiment, grant all the wishes of the practitioners of identity politics. Let's assume that in the ruling class, there is a proportion of blacks, in proportion as they are of the total population. There is a proportion of transgender people, as they are in the existing population, of various minorities, and so on and so forth. Let's assume they're all put in that position. What would change? Nothing. The system would still continue to operate, because it's not a process that is determined by personality or personal directive. It's an objective process deriving from the capitalist market itself, from the market system. It's an objective process through which surplus value is extracted out of the working class. So it doesn't matter what the nationality or ethnicity or whatever of your employer is, you sell your labour power and surplus value and ultimately profit is extracted through that process. That's the basis of society. So the only way in which all the evils, all the social distress now erupting out of this society can be overturned is through a revolution by the class which lies at the base of this society, the working class that sells its labour power to capital. Now, the forms in which that labour is carried out has, as we noted, changed over the years. We don't have workers making carts. They make cars, and they make cars very differently from what they did 50 or 60 years ago. The forms of labour are continually changing, but the social relationship within which that labour is carried out have remained the same. The worker in the cotton mill of the Industrial Revolution sells his or her labour power to the capitalist. The worker working in a high-tech company or whatever today has the same relationship, selling his or her labour power to the owner of the means of production. That social relation has remained the same.
Just flowing on from Nick's comments, I mean, the working class is not the working class because of its race, because of its nationality, and not even because it thinks they're workers or part of a working class, but it is an objective relationship to the means of production. The working class owns nothing in regards to the means of production, in regards to the methods and the mechanisms that undertake production and the extraction of surplus value. And so the question of whether it is a revolutionary class, which it is the class which was brought into existence under capitalism, and is the only class which can actually carry through the overthrow of capitalism, which can carry through the development of the means of production to a higher level of productive forces, and that is under socialism. And so I think when we talk about the question of race, which has now become a major political issue on an international scale, and there is no question, there is racism. No one is denying that there is a level of racial vilification and attack which is carried out against sections of the working class. but it is the attacks which are carried out by the police against black workers in the United States, against Hispanic workers, is carried out because they're workers, not just because they're black. And what is being promoted very, very consciously, and I don't think it should be underestimated, the level of consciousness which now animates the promotion of racial-based politics, of the racial narrative, is done so in order to divide the working class. The fact that the Democratic Party, the very privileged level sections of middle class, racially based sections of academia, the Nicole Hannah-Jones, the Black Lives Matter, was so hostile to the very broad-based demonstrations and protests that took place against the murder of George Floyd was not accidental. The fact that white students and workers and young people were accused of, basing themselves on the pain of black people was because the very unification of the working class, the very international unification of the working class, cuts across the class interests of these very privileged layers, the Black Lives Matter layers. And if one looks at objectively the levels of inequality which exist amongst the African American population in the United States, if that demographic was in fact a nation of its own, it would be one of the most unequal in the world. You have layers of black academia, of black sections of the bourgeoisie who earn more than the rest. The highest 10% earn more than the bottom 90% of black workers. These are people who are protecting the very wealth and position that they have accumulated, particularly since the 1960s. And the unification of the working class, the very broad nature of these demonstrations themselves, were a threat to that, to those privileges, and so the whole development of a racially based narrative, the fact that the revolutionary traditions of the American bourgeoisie itself, in the Declaration of Independence, in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, is now being attacked, takes place at the same time that in fact the President of the United States, Donald Trump, itself carried through an attack against the Constitution on June the 1st. And that attack has, while it has been delayed, has certainly not been dispensed with. And so you have now a very conscious layer attempting to create class and racial antagonism within the working class as a means of dividing it.
Thanks, Cheryl. Those are really important points. And I would encourage, again, everybody participating to think about a question that you'd like to put. This is a really good opportunity. We don't often have comrades with such political experience and authority as Nick and Cheryl with us at one time online. So I noticed in the attendees a few familiar names in the participation box. If you'd like to ask anything at all about the political situation today, you're more than welcome to. There's no such thing as a bad question. I would like to make some announcements in relationship to Merriam Books. Just before I do that, I'm going to put the next question announce the Merriam books and then come back to the answer, if that makes sense. The next question is from Rodney. Good evening, Rodney. And his question is, what are the strategic lessons of the international working class in the revolutionary struggles of 1968 to 1975? So that is the last period of international revolutionary upsurge, 1968-75. What are the political and strategic lessons? While our panelists are considering that one, I'd like to just briefly encourage everybody here to consider purchasing some of our offerings from Merriam Books tonight. We are again discounting 15% off the first book. All of the books tonight, there's 3 of them I'm going to speak about. They're all by David North. David North, as you can see there, is chairman of the World Socialist Website International Editorial Board, also chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, a long-standing leader within the Trotskyist movement, author of numerous books and lectures, as well as, of course, articles and perspectives on the World Socialist website. This book that you can see on the panel on your screen now is The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. This is a really crucial book that brings together a whole series of lectures, articles, statements by David North over several years, dealing with a whole range of critical issues that touch on some of the historical and strategic lessons of the 20th century that we have been covering in this lecture series itself. Just to give you a range of what this book covers, it begins with the Bolsheviks' seizure of power in October 1917, posing the question as to whether or not this is a coup or a revolution. It is the latter, spoiler alert. Going through the questions of Stalinism, the issue of Leon Trotsky and the founding of the Fourth International, deals with the questions of the trade unions, the questions of postmodernism, Lenin's theory of socialist consciousness and the origins of Bolshevism, as well as a wide range of other historical and philosophical issues. So I very much encourage everyone to buy that. That's just $21.20. You can see the email address there, merring@aussiemail.com.au. If you're in Australia, please send us an email via that and we will be in touch with delivery details. If you're an international participant, you can log on to merring.com. The next book that you can see is the Frankfurt School, Postmodernism and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left. This is a really crucial work that came out 5 years ago now. It deals with a whole series of complex philosophical and political issues, but does so in the most accessible and helpful manner. It deals with the questions of the Frankfurt School, which is an anti-Marxist philosophical and political tendency that emerged in the 1930s and after World War II, had a very influential, very detrimental impact within intellectual circles, within academia, that's still felt today, related to the questions of postmodernism, which is a philosophical tendency which seeks to junk any conception of an objective knowledge of history, an objective knowledge of the real world. And this is related by Comrade David North in this book to the political issues dealing with the pseudo-left. It was published just after the immense betrayal in Greece by the Syriza party, that is the coalition of the radical left, so-called in Greece, which implemented brutal austerity measures on behalf of European and global finance capital, despite the principled and heroic efforts of the Greek working class to defeat the referendum that advanced that mechanism. So all these complex political and philosophical ideas are tied together in this book, which is again on offer there for $21.20, which is very cheap indeed. And finally, those of you who've been participating in previous lectures will be familiar with my advertisements for this book, The Heritage We Defend, a contribution to the history of the Fourth International. It really is an inescapable resource for all aspiring socialists and Trotskyists in this period. It reviews the history of the Fourth International going back to before its establishment in 1938, taking it forward through to the 1985-86 split with the WRP National-Opportunists, and the 30th anniversary edition, which Comrade Dave North wrote very recently, again, deals with the contemporary significance of this work. Without a review of the struggle against opportunism and revisionism within the Fourth International, it really is impossible to orient oneself in this current immensely tumultuous period without an understanding of this history and of these political lessons. So again, very much encourage everybody participating tonight who doesn't have this book to order now via merring@aussiemail.com.au. So I'll pass it back to the panelists. The question again was dealing with the issue of the lessons to be drawn from the period 1968 to 1975. And perhaps our panelists could refer to your own political development and emergence in this period.
Well, I think, firstly, the question is very directly dealt with. We're not advertising it tonight, but the Perspectives document of the International Committee in 1988 contained a very thorough review of that experience. We explained that 68 to 75 was a period of revolutionary upsurge. It opened with a general strike in France, which was sparked initially by student protests at the Sorbonne, but with the intervention of the police, the hated CS in France, the riot police, the working class came on the scene. However, that working class was held back, betrayed and suppressed by the Stalinist bureaucracy. I remember if you refer to my experiences, I remember in 1968 following very closely the developments in France, and there was an interesting article from two journalists for the Times newspaper in London. And they wrote, somewhat amazed, that the French Communist Party was not seeking to advance this potentially revolutionary movement of the working class, but to hold it back and stop it. It was so clear. Now, that was the experience that was to unfold internationally in the Italian hot autumn of 1969, the enormous struggles in Britain, which culminated in the miners' strike of 73-74, social democracy playing the role. And of course, above all, very sharply, in the revolutionary struggles that convulsed Chile from 1970 to 73, the election of the Allende presidency, accompanied by ongoing struggles of the working class, to the extent that in response to the attempt of independent truck driver owners working very directly with the CIA and other reactionary forces to overturn the government, workers took over vast sections of the industrial enterprises in major cities. And a revolutionary situation was clearly developing. But the crucial question we posed, as we explained that social democracy, Stalinism, and other organizations, the trade union apparatuses, had betrayed this revolutionary movement. The crucial question we posed in that document was, why was the Trotskyist movement not able to intervene and take the leadership of these forces against these, of the working class movement, against these betrayals? And that focused on the most crucial strategic lesson, indeed, of the whole post-war period. The Trotskyist movement at that point was not able to do that because of the enormous ravages inflicted upon it by Pavlovism in the post-war period. Most clear examples, I would say, were Chile and Sri Lanka. I mean, in Sri Lanka, the LSSP, the Lanka Samasamaja Party, was a mass party. They could hold and did hold meetings of 50,000, 100,000 on Gallface Green in Colombo. I mean, they were known throughout the length and breadth of the island. But in 1964, when an eruption, a struggle developed in the working class, the 21 Demands movement, as it was called, the Bandaranaike government, faced with the alternative of calling in the troops to suppress the movement, or as Mrs. Bandaranaike said, calling the workers' leaders into the government, decided on the latter course, and the LSSP carried out this betrayal. In Chile, you had a situation where the Chilean Trotskyists, on the basis of the revisions of Pavlovism, were liquidated into a petty bourgeois national movement, the MIR, the movement of the revolutionary left, based on Castroism, guerrilla struggle, and so on. If you study Zach Ambiti's lecture, he goes into that somewhat. So the crucial strategic lesson to be drawn from this experience was twofold, connected. Firstly, the decisive role of revolutionary leadership in a revolutionary situation. There's no question, in a whole series of countries, there were developments that could have led to socialist revolution. Why didn't they? Because of the betrayals of the existing leadership, Why was the Trotskyist movement not able to wrest control from that leadership? Because it had been attacked and ravaged in the preceding period. And so the lessons to be drawn from that experience, the strategic lesson, is the absolute centrality of the struggle against all forms of opportunism, which seek in one way or another to subordinate the independent interests of the working class to the bourgeoisie. Now that takes new forms as historical development takes place. And as Cheryl so well outlined, that one of the forms it takes today is to subordinate the independent interests of the working class under the banner of race.
Cheryl?
Yeah. I mean, I think the points that Nick has raised really, do cover the most essential issues. I mean, the same, the process, or in that sense, the generation that Nick and I come from, although I'm so much younger than Nick, it was one which was part of that upsurge, that revolutionary upsurge of the working class in countries such as Australia, certainly the United States, Britain. The campaign and the movement, particularly against the imperialist war in Vietnam, was a central experience, and one in which that the generational issues that were raised in that sense were still very much within the framework of the domination of Stalinism and social democracy. Certainly the struggles which Nick have outlined, and these were revolutionary struggles. I mean, capitalism faced a revolutionary upsurge of the working class, but this still was under conditions where broad sections of workers still had illusions in Stalinism. They had a certain allegiance in sections of social democracy. And the role that Pabloism played was to consistently shift that movement still, or refuse to break that movement from these mass organizations which existed. And they played a really counter-revolutionary role. And so the founding of parties, which Comrade Oscar went through last week, in the United States in 66, 68 in Sri Lanka, 71 in Germany and 72 in Australia, were part of the lessons and the response to the fight by particularly the British Socialist Labour League against the reunification of the Socialist Workers' Party to Pabloism, and the fight for the development of an independent revolutionary movement that would fight for the leadership of the working class under these conditions. Now, the parties, the International Committee was not able to wrest control of those movements from these organisations as they existed. And certainly the same sort of revolutionary struggles took place in Australia in the sacking of the Whitlam government in 1975. The ability of Hawke, of the Labor Party, of the ACTU to maintain control and to prevent general strike and revolutionary struggles in 1975 was particularly enabled by the role of the communist parties. The difference now, however, and it is not an insignificant, in fact, it is a most profound difference, is those organisations either don't exist or they are literally shells of their previous existence. I mean, the Labor Party in Australia has an increasingly fractured or reduced support within the working class under conditions where you have, you know, the by-election in Eden Monaro last weekend, the Labor Party under conditions of pandemic, of mass unemployment, of increasing poverty within Australia, following the bushfires, it was still unable to even gain any increase in its vote. In fact, it lost 3%. I mean, these organisations do not exist in the same way that they even did in 1968-75. The task which confronts our party now is the leadership of the working class, and the struggles which are developing, and certainly, again, Australia is no exception. I mean, I think, you know, the response to the lockdown of the Housing Commission workers in Melbourne, 3,000 workers who confront, and families who confront a medical crisis and who are treated as criminals. Who the response of the Andrews government is a police response. I mean, I think the opposition and the outpouring of support which exists amongst, you know, workers throughout Melbourne itself express this developing movement within the working class. And our movement has to fight to win that leadership. Our movement is the movement that will fight for the development of a political and socialist perspective, to fight for the development of the leadership of that movement. Though the existence of the communist parties, the social democrats that even existed in the last revolutionary period no longer exist any longer. And that's what the responsibility and the lessons in that sense that we have to draw from that last period for this now, what is a revolutionary situation which is developing now.
These are all really crucial issues within the current political climate, and it's important that we discuss them thoroughly. We are at the same time having a lot of questions coming in, and I am mindful of the time. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Before we proceed to the next one though, I would like to now take up a collection for the Socialist Equality Party's monthly fund. Again, many of you are familiar, those of you who've been with us in previous lectures in this series, familiar that we do raise the necessary financing that supports the political work of our party, not just here in Australia, but also the contribution that we make to the World Socialist website and to our sister parties internationally comes through the support, the sacrifice, the generosity of ordinary working class people, of young people, of retirees, of pensioners, and so on. So again, appreciate your financial support. The next question I'd like to get to is, I think it's an important one. This is from a participant in Darwin who asks, excuse me, what actions can the working class do to stop the main media propaganda machine continue to spread misinformation and divide and conquer tactics? So what actions can the working class take to stop the media propaganda machine? Related to that, there was another comment from a participant from India who raised the question about transnational collaboration on media advocacy, which perhaps touches on the role of the World Socialist website, as does the first question.
The short answer to the issue is we can't control the media. We don't own them. They own them. It's owned by giant corporations, Murdoch's News Limited, Nine, and so on. And of course, what has absolutely been exposed is in the recent period, and let's just consider the case of Julian Assange, the entire media organisations back the jailing of this courageous journalist, placing him on horrendous charges in the United States for printing the truth. More and more, the media machines, New York Times, the papers in Britain, the newspaper, the Murdoch empire in this country, and the Nine empire. I mean, don't function really anymore as journalists. They very much function as the outlets for the state, for the military. Look what the role they played in the Gulf War of 2003. We have, of course, the anti-Russia campaign, and now we have all the media on board with the anti-China campaign. There's not a day goes by in the mass media in this country where there isn't some anti-China story, all aimed at creating within the population support for war. So we can't change that. What we can do, and what we have been doing, and what has to be done, is to build the organisation which speaks in the interest of the working class. And that's the World Socialist website. That's how we are going to counter the media giants and develop the consciousness in the working class of what it has to do, and to expose and lay bare, as we do every day, the lies pumped out by the capitalist mass media, and develop other forms of communication such as we're using tonight. But above all, the way in which we can do this is through the development of the World Socialist website. And above all, to everyone here, not just to leave it at the site, but to circulate the articles. You can play a very decisive role in developing the medium of the working class, that is the WSWS, by circulating it through social media, on Facebook, on all the links that you're involved in, circulating it through the working class and building and developing this readership of the WSWS here in Australia and on the international scale. That's the task we have to undertake. And in that we follow very directly the traditions of the Bolshevik Party, which Lenin began his work as a revolutionist. Or one of the crucial questions he began his work as a revolutionist was building an all-Russian newspaper, Iskra. The different struggles in Russia had to be unified with a common understanding, common theory, common program, and common organisation. Well, more than 100 years has passed, but we're still, that's the same basis to now develop at a much higher level an international organ of working class struggle, news, analysis, culture, very important, the explanation of all the events confronting the working class internationally. And so that's how we fight the media giants and the capitalist interests that they represent.
Cheryl, can you add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, absolutely what Nick has raised is correct. We fight for objective truth. What we do on the World Socialist website is present the truth to the working class. And the fact that the World Socialist website is now the most widely read socialist newspaper in website in the world is testament to the fact that there is a striving by broad sections of workers, young people, professionals, middle class people for the truth. And I think our online forum on Sunday morning was testament to that. The fact that 72 participants from 72 countries took part. I think it's 8,000 people participated on the night. Look, there is a striving, there is a desire for an alternative. We can't stop what the media does, but we certainly can provide the truth and an alternative, and that's what we do. And I think, as Nick says, you know, what you can do, what we can do, is fight to disseminate, distribute, get our articles, our website into as many Facebook pages, Twitter, other social media, get it distributed in factories, in workplaces, and increase the readership. And that's how we deal with the media.
Just on that point, I mean, the readership of the World Socialist website has seen an extraordinary increase this year. We've risen, I mean, if you look at alexa.com, which is one website ranking service, the World Socialist website is now amongst the top, I believe it's 12 or 13,000 websites in the world, which is just extraordinary. And that's without any sort of corporate backers, advertising and so on. This is the working class reaching out to the idea, as well as the socialist principle reaching out to the working class. We have readers in every continent, major readership developing in countries such as Turkey, Brazil, other areas. And it's an indication of the revolutionary period that we've entered into, as Nick was raising, like in 1968 to 1975, or sorry, I think it was Cheryl, the International Committee established new sections in multiple countries. We're now in the process of doing likewise in New Zealand, in Turkey, Brazil, Ireland. I mean, one could go on. This is another indication of the growing reach of the organ of genuine Trotskyism, of genuine Marxism, and that is the World Socialist website. So those of you participating tonight who aren't regular readers, be sure to do that. Every day there's an extraordinary presentation of a Marxist analysis of the day's events, both in qualitative and quantitative terms. It is unmatched, and that is our answer, our riposte to the filth and the lies of the mass media, and that is something that we treasure and base our optimism upon. I'd like to now move to the next.
Just to interrupt, Patrick, I mean, just one other point. I mean, not only does the media, put forward lies, but there is an active attempt to block us and censor our website. I mean, one of the points that Comrade North raised on Sunday morning in the historians' discussion is that Reddit had actually banned the advertising for the event. Fearful are they of an open, honest discussion on the questions of history. And so the fact that we have achieved such as Patrick said, such an increase in the readership is despite and in opposition to the attempts to censor us.
That's another important point. Thank you, Cheryl. We are running out of time, unfortunately. It's been a very fruitful discussion, I think. I would like to squeeze in, if it's possible, two both really valuable questions. How will the revolutionary working class be able to stand up against the brutal police and military repression that is only just beginning to show its teeth? In Germany, right-wing extremism already riddles the army, universities, the media, and the judiciary. In Germany and the United States, outright fascist groups engage in regular military training. Where do we get the strength to prevail against such intimidation? So that's one question. And the other question is, the COVID epidemic has caused a beginning of a revolution. Would this have occurred without COVID?
Firstly, how do we get the strength to confront the brutal power? Well, the working class has enormous social power. I spoke about industrial workers, and yes, they've declined as a percentage of the working population, but they have enormous social power. Can shut down whole cities, take over factories. The problem in the working class is once was characterized in the following way. The strength of the bourgeoisie is it knows how weak it is. The weakness of the working class, it doesn't know how strong it is. Now, it's that enormous social power, and we saw that in the American working class in the 1930s. Yes, they faced goons, fascist bands, guards trying to shoot them, but and so on, and there were pitched battles. And the Australian working class and the British working class and the working class of India and China are no different. You see, this is always put forward by the apologists of the bourgeoisie, or those who would say, well, the bourgeoisie is too strong and so on. Well, and always, for example, in the most recent period, they point to the issue of Chile and say, well, the CIA was too strong, the army was too strong. No, that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the working class was politically disarmed. Let's go back in history. If you apply that criterion, the Russian Revolution should never have been attempted.
because immediately from its outset, from its successful conquest of power, it was confronted by 14 imperialist armies, very much better armed than the starved worker state. But it was able to defeat those armies. Why? Because of two factors: the enormous sacrifice and heroism of the Russian working class, but also because of the international upsurge of the working class out of which the Russian Revolution came. Woodrow Wilson would have liked to have sent troops into Russia. He did send some. He would have liked to have sent more, but he was fearful that if he did so, a revolution would develop in the United States and in other countries. So the issue is, how do we defeat the powers of the military, of the fascists and so on? The fascists are not a mass force in the United States. We've seen mass demonstration of workers. How many millions? I mean, the CSIS, for example, noted, as I quoted, the outbreak of demonstrations in the United States have been among the largest in history following the Trump presidency. That's the social power of the working class, far outweighs the pathetic forces that Trump would like to muster. I mean, millions turned out around the country against his inauguration in Washington. He trumpeted that he was going to get 1 million at Tulsa in Oklahoma. He barely half filled a stadium. Had 60-odd thousand, perhaps. No, the tide of history and the movement of the masses is not to the right. It's not to, yes, the state is promoting fascist forces in every country, in Germany, Britain, United States, and so on. But the movement of the mass of the population is to the left. And armed with a political perspective, that's the crucial issue in defeating the forces that will be attempted to be mobilized against it. And all sorts of contradictions can emerge within the armed forces themselves. Yes, the state may mobilize the National Guard against workers, but then the National Guard have families. They come from the working class. They know people have had COVID and so on. They're affected by these developments. So the issue is, if the working class can show and demonstrate and develop a political perspective aimed at the conquest of political power, then it can break up, defeat whatever forces are thrown against it by the bourgeoisie. Would this situation have developed had the COVID pandemic not happened? Well, we drew a parallel with World War I. You know, one could ask, would World War I have broken out if Archduke Ferdinand, would it have broken out on August the 4th, 1914, if Archduke Ferdinand had not been assassinated on June 28th? Probably not. But it would have come at some other period, very shortly, because all the tensions were emerging. In fact, Europe had come to the brink of war in the period immediately prior to 1914. 1912, 1913, there was a crisis in the Balkans, which was only averted, incidentally, by the joint intervention of Germany and Britain acting together to prevent a crisis from erupting. A year and a half later, they were going to be at each other's throats. The point we have made is that the assassination of the Archduke was like a match being thrown into a powder keg of explosive material. The same with regard to the COVID pandemic. Because why has the COVID pandemic been so devastating? Because of the enormous build-up of debt, of the mechanisms used over the last 12 years by the bourgeoisie to bail themselves out of the last crisis in 2008. They solved nothing. They just increased the contradictions by piling more and more debt upon the mountain that was already created. So if it hadn't have been COVID-19 that set off a financial, economic crisis, it would have been something else, because the contradictions were developing and within the capitalist financial system and economy itself. It would have taken another form, but it takes the explosive character of its effects arise from
the material foundations in which this pandemic sparked this global crisis.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll be brief. We have described the COVID-19 pandemic as a trigger event. It did not create the crisis of capitalism, but it has certainly accelerated it, as Nick has gone through. If it wasn't COVID-19, yes, it would have been something else. But the fact that it's a pandemic did not come out of a clear blue sky. It has been warned about. It has been predicted for now 15 years. The fact that the level of infections has now reached over 11.7 million. In the next few days, it will be 12 million. Only 4 or 5 days ago, it was 11 million. 4 days before that, it was 10 million. The acceleration of this pandemic is now literally becoming out of control. What is becoming clear to millions and millions of workers is that their lives to the capitalist class means nothing. They are being driven back into factories. They are being forced to go back into their workplaces in order that the capitalist class can extract surplus value and pay for the trillions of dollars of debt that Nick just outlined. And if workers die doing this, then so be it, they will be replaced. And that is a realization that is an international experience. What is happening in the towers in Melbourne is just a small indication of the attitude of Labor, Liberal, of governments in this country, of governments everywhere else, to the working class. Workers' lives are dispensable. And in order that the working class is able to live, their very lives are able to be protected, it means capitalism has to be overthrown. What workers need is not guns so much as a political perspective, as a political program. If they have that program, and as Nick has outlined, what they lacked in Chile was not being armed, but was a perspective in order to deal with not just the fascists, but with Allende, with the MIR, with the leadership of their own organisations. And that is what is required today. The working class needs a political perspective. What we fight for is that workers establish factory committees, safety committees, so that they take the dealing of the pandemic out of the hands of the capitalist class. Capitalism has proven they will not carry through the mechanisms and the program necessary to deal with this medical crisis. This has been treated as an economic crisis from the outset. And in order that workers' lives are protected, their families are protected, it means that they have to undertake a political struggle. And that's why we're fighting for the working class itself to deal with this, for factory committees to be established, for safety committees in schools, in workplaces, on construction sites, wherever there are the threat to life and limb, which COVID-19 expresses, then the working class has got to deal with it themselves. And if workers understand that and take up these political struggles, they will deal with the fascists. They will deal with the army, with the police. I think that's the major issue that we now confront.
Thanks, Nick and Cheryl. Your remarks provide a helpful segue to conclude this event tonight, and that is to appeal to everybody here tonight to join this movement. This is what's required. This is what's posed before all workers, young people, supporters of the struggle against this outmoded capitalist system, supporters of the struggle for international socialism. The principles upon which you join are articulated very succinctly in the document that you can see there on your slide, the Statement of Principles, which was adopted at our founding Congress. You can order that via the link that you can see there. We are a movement providing not simple answers, simplistic slogans, but rather a thought out, historically based perspective. We're a movement saturated in history. We base our political perspective upon the lessons of the entire strategic experiences through which the international working class has passed in the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The previous slide that you saw there on the historians' discussion with comrades David North and Tom Ackerman, which was referred to both in the lecture by Nick Beams and multiple times in the remarks in the discussion period by comrade Cheryl, is really critical listening and viewing. This was an event, for those of you who aren't aware, organised by the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, and it features a discussion with extraordinarily distinguished historians in the United States, esteemed historians at the pinnacle of their field for several decades now, turning to the Trotskyist movement in order to develop this discussion on defending the powerful and principled legacy of the 1776 American Revolution and the Civil War that led to the abolition of slavery due to the leadership or under the leadership of American President Abraham Lincoln. These are principles and historical figures who are being torn down both figuratively and literally now in the United States by the purveyors of racial identity politics. And we have taken up a principled stand in defense of the bourgeois democratic revolution in the United States as a means of clarifying these crucial historical issues. And you can see the link there. I'd encourage everybody participating tonight to click on that link and to watch that event. It may seem somewhat unusual to connect joining the Trotskyist movement here in Australia now with a review of the lessons of 1776 and 1865, but from our perspective, there's nothing unusual about it whatsoever. This is a defense of revolutionary principle, taking forward the struggle for socialism based on historical clarity, historical truth, and that is what we've sought to do through this entire lecture series. Again, this is a matter of great urgency now, joining our movement, building it, turning to the working class, turning to the campuses, recruiting working class young people and others to build this movement as the necessary revolutionary leadership. So I'd encourage everybody here again to give very serious consideration to doing that tonight. I would like to conclude by thanking everybody for your very generous financial contributions again. Reiterate my appeal to make a regular monthly pledge if you're in a position to do so. And just to conclude by thanking all of our participants in the lecture series, comrades Max Boddy, Oscar Grenfell, Zach Hambides, and with us tonight, of course, and previously, Nick Beams and Cheryl Crisp. It's been a pleasure to have the honour to have participated in it myself, so thanks everybody. And we'll conclude tonight's event and be sure to keep in touch. Let us know your contact details if you haven't already, and continue to regularly read and support the work of the World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party. But good evening, everybody, and we'll see you another time. Thank you.